My name is Taylor Wolf. I'm Manager of State Policy with AFSP. I have Dr. Doreen Marshall, who oversees AFSP's Prevention and Education and Loss and Healing programs, which includes community-based suicide prevention training, clinician training, AFSP's Survivor Outreach Program for survivors of suicide loss, and Program for International Survivors of Suicide Loss Day. She has served as a consultant for both national and state suicide prevention and post-prevention initiatives, which included providing suicide prevention training for the Division of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities and serving on a task force of the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention. I also have Tyler West. Excuse me. Tyler has been a board member for the Arkansas chapter for 6 years, wearing a few different hats along the way, including fundraising chair, walk chair, advocacy chair, and he also serves on the AFSP National Public Policy Council. He was awarded the certificate, and he currently owns a group of healthcare companies providing care and support for people around the country. So I'm going to have Doreen start.
Good morning, everyone. Okay. As Taylor mentioned, I'm Doreen Marshall. I am the Vice President of Programs at our national office at AFSP. And relevant to this presentation, I have served as point for our firearms and suicide prevention work at the national office, working with several others at our national office, but also Michael Rosenoff, who is our Senior Director for Project 2025. So just to give you kind of an overview of what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about just our firearms work in the context of Project 2025, and I'm going to give some quick updates on what we've done with the firearms work. And then Taylor and Tyler are going to talk a little bit more about the work in extreme risk protective orders and what's happened in Tyler's state around that. So just anybody not hear of Project 2025? Good. I can do the Cliff Notes then. The firearms work is one of our pathways in Project 2025. For those of you that may not know the history of Project 2025, we convened a group of experts, reviewed the literature, with the question of if we're going to really move the needle on suicide numbers, if we're really going to lower that rate, where are the areas to focus? And there's a number of ways you could look at this. You could look at it populations, you can look at kind of short-term risk, long-term risk, different factors. But what we looked at was how do we reach the most people at risk? And firearms became a pathway because we know that if you look at national numbers, about half of all suicides are by firearm. And my guess is if I talk to some of you in particular states, it's way more than half. I live in Georgia. The numbers are upward higher than 50% of suicides because we are more of a firearm owning state. So firearms became one of our pathways. And the idea was that if we focus on educating firearm owners about the connection between suicide risk and really unsafe storage of firearms. So it really becomes an access issue. It's not just ownership, it's having a firearm accessible. And so we looked at that pathway and we thought if we could deliver education of firearm owners, and let's say, and this is hypothetical of course, but based on the literature, let's say that education leads to changes in behavior in 1 of 5 people that get that. So that's pretty conservative, right? 5 people get material, 1 of them changes behavior based on that. We could save an estimated 9,500 lives with that pathway. So that really informed our approach in the firearm space. And so then we asked the question of, well, how do we reach firearm owners? Where are they, right? And what are the groups that have some natural connections with them? And that's how we became connected to the National Shooting Sports Foundation. But there are other groups who we will be either working on partnerships with or discussing this issue with to see if there's a way to help leverage that process. Locally, I would say all of you know who your firearm constituents are, or if you don't know, this would be a good question to take back. Like, where are they? Is it the VA, veterans? Is it through that group? We also have a partnership with the Veterans Administration that NSSF is part of. Is it gun clubs? Is it, your VFW? Like, where are the natural places where you can find firearm owners to provide this kind of education? Interestingly, I'm speaking at, this is a bit of an aside, but I'm speaking at the conference in August for the Well-Armed Woman, which I had no idea this group existed, and they heard about our work with NSSF, and we kind of made a connection, and they have chapters just like we have chapters throughout the country. So expect to be hearing more, but again, another leverage point for how we get our education and our information about suicide prevention out to this community. I will tell you just anecdotally, I've worked a lot with the firearm owning community, and they know lots about safety. They know lots about safe storage of firearms, which they've informed us about. What they didn't know was the connection to suicide. And that's what we bring to these discussions, the education about suicide. And you could almost, in these conversations, kind of see a light bulb go off when we tell them that, 2/3 of all firearm deaths are deaths by suicide. Many of them did not know that data. And it kind of, if you think of all the firearm owners I know, one of the things that they are very focused on is preventing misuse of firearms. And someone taking their life with a firearm in their mind is a misuse of a firearm, right? So sharing that data with them, really, I think it was a shared problem, right? That politics aside, beliefs about ownership aside, it was a shared problem. We want to prevent suicide. They want to prevent suicide in their constituents too. And the other thing I would just add is, not surprisingly, firearm owning communities are communities that have been touched by suicide. So almost to a person, every firearm owner or retailer I talked to could tell me someone they knew that died by suicide, a fellow firearm owner, a friend, a family member. So I just want to put that out there, because one of the things you all are good at is connecting with communities who have been impacted. And so, if you think about how do I start these conversations at the local level, honestly, that's how. It's with what we know about suicide, which is our lane as an organization, but it's also about acknowledging that communities have been impacted. And the firearms owning community is a community that's been impacted by suicide, as many of our communities are. So really quickly, I'm going to give you an update. Anybody not seen these materials, if you're new to AFSP, maybe you haven't, but this is the work we did in development with NSSF. We presented this material to them. They advised us on things like language, but it's around this idea of having a brave conversation within the firearm owning community about suicide. And you can't probably see the copy on that, but basically the theme of it is have your buddies back. It's okay to ask directly about suicide. So it's kind of empowering other firearm owners to ask each other, right, and to talk with each other about suicide risk. That the brochure on the right is a guide we developed for retailers and range owners who had suicides that, the way I think of it is, they were connected to their establishment. So a shooting range who had a suicide, for example, that occurred at their establishment, or a retailer who learns after the fact that their establishment sold a gun to someone who then took their life. Because as you might imagine, the staff of these establishments are affected, and really the community, the customer base is also affected. So I've been on calls with range owners after there's been a firearm suicide, and I mean, the staff is devastated. Often they were there, or they somehow witnessed. So as many of us that have been impacted by suicide loss have, there's that component they're dealing with. But also there were often other customers in the establishment, and particularly the shooting ranges when this occurred. So it's really about providing that community postvention and guiding ranges as to how to do that. So I just want to make sure you know that resource exists. This is these are register stickers, window stickers, different things to help promote that they can display in their establishment. Our website, so let me get to some of the numbers. So these numbers were pulled earlier this year. They've gone slightly higher than this. So far, our chapters have done 80 of the Talk Saves Lives, firearms, and suicide prevention. So we have a version that's specific around firearm ownership. It's reached about 3,000 people. We have some activity going on in 32 states, and that number is slightly higher now. But by that, I mean people at the chapter level bringing this education into their communities. NSSF also sent a very large mailing, I think it was over 10,000, to their member retailers and ranges last April. And then they did a second mailing to what's called FFSLs, which are Federal Firearm Sale Licensees. So they're people, think your pawn shop owners, others who are able to sell firearms that have a federal license to sell them. So they kind of went beyond the ranges to reach this other audience that may not be NSSF members, but also are interacting with people around the sale of firearms. Really quick, what I would say is if you go back to your chapters and you have not done anything in the firearms community, it's not too late to start. We're happy to help you at National get started. You can send me or anyone on the Prevention Ed team kind of an email saying, hey, we want to do something. How can you help us get started? We have lots of chapters who are doing great work in this area, and I'm happy to make those connections. We do want to reach also instructors, firearm safety instructors who need suicide prevention materials to cover in their classes. The feedback I've gotten so far on this, I will tell you, which is informing our next work with NSSF, is if you've ever been to a firearm safety course, they've got lots of objectives to cover. We gave them all this great material, and they said, this is fantastic, but I don't have 30 minutes to spend on suicide prevention in a course that's 90 minutes. I have 5, maybe 10. Can you give us something that kind of hits the key points, a quick video I can pop in, a brochure I can hand out? So again, they want to cover it. They just have to cover lots of objectives otherwise that sometimes are state-driven in terms of what firearm courses have to cover. We're going to find out what are some of the obstacles to getting this information out, and then thinking beyond, if you think about where firearm owners are in your community, there are groups that this naturally, law enforcement, for example, most of them own a personal firearm in addition to their employer-issued firearm. So think kind of broadly, like where are they in my community? Because those are the places to take this information forward. So with that, I'm going to leave on this slide just in case you're wondering what to do. Here's some really quick next action steps. And so now I will turn it back over to Taylor to talk a little bit more about extreme risk protective orders.
Okay, so how many people are familiar with extreme risk protection orders, or ERPOs, red flag? Okay, a good number of you. So red flag describes state laws. Extreme risk protection order is one phrase that we use or term. Also, it might be lethal violence protection order or gun violence restraining order. So for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to say ERPO. So it allows law enforcement to temporarily remove all firearms from the ownership of a person who's deemed at risk of harming themselves or others, and prevents that person from purchasing a firearm while the order is in place. So to initiate the process, a petitioner must provide the court with an explanation of the concerning actions and a list of known firearms in the person's possession. So typically, the petitioner files for an ERPO or an emergency ex parte ERPO, in which case there isn't a hearing where the subject's there, and the court decides that day. So if they grant it, the firearms are relinquished or seized immediately. However, a few days later, typically 7 to 10 days, then they will hold a hearing for the final order. And I went too far here. Okay, so the reason that AFSP got involved is that we know suicide risk increases when any type of lethal means are readily available. Safe storage and or temporary removal of a firearm during a time of increased risk give suicidal individuals something they desperately need, time for that risk to diminish, and time for someone to intervene with the mental health resources they might need and other resources. We want it to be voluntary whenever possible, that temporary removal. However, we know that is not always possible. So there needs to be a mechanism in place that helps families when that is not, when they're not able to do it voluntarily. And typically it's either law enforcement or family members who are allowed to petition. Some states it might be a little more expansive. So the map on here shows where they've been enacted, failed, and introduced. So prior to 2018, which is prior to when AFSP started working on these bills, they had laws in Connecticut, Indiana, California, Washington, and Oregon. In 2018, when we started tracking them and working on a model policy of our own, Florida, Vermont, Maryland, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Delaware, Massachusetts, Illinois, and DC all enacted laws just last year. And then so far in 2019, New York, Colorado, and there's also a bill in Nevada I'm pretty sure is going to pass. It's on the governor's desk. So as we can see, this is moving quickly, which is why we knew we had to kind of get involved and be a part of it to make sure that they are addressing suicide risk in a responsible way. So the key considerations, we want to know the timing and urgency of a court decision. So we want to make sure there's that emergency ex parte process because of the possible imminent risk in a case of suicide risk. At the same time, we want to make sure there's high standard for securing the order and due process protections. We want to make sure the hearing's held shortly after that. You know, we don't want it to be 30 days. We recommend, I think, 5 to 7 days. And we want to make sure the burden of the proof is on the petitioner. We also want to make sure there's related educational materials for the public, for the families so they know what mechanisms are available to them, and for police officers in the court systems. We want to make sure they know how to carry out these responsibly. And a good example is California developed a website so you could basically go on there and depending if you're a family member, mental health worker, police officer, know what the process is for you. We also want to make sure there's data collection. The only way we're going to know these are going to work, particularly in cases of suicide, is if we're collecting data on it and looking at it year to year. And we've actually been successful in getting that data collection in a number of bills, so good news there. We also want to know, is it a standalone bill, just a red flag bill, or is it embedded in a larger piece of legislation? So, for instance, in Florida, there was a lot of other firearm pieces in the piece of legislation, so we wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to affect what we were trying to do with the red flag, or the ERPO rather. So the most common key considerations we give, here I can't get the thing to scroll down, I'm sorry. So like I said, we want to make sure there's the emergency ex parte because of the suicidal risk is so imminent, that the court decision's made the same day and that it's served that same day if possible. We want to make sure that there's language for suicide prevention. I want to emphasize that mental health alone is not sufficient grounds for an order. That's part of our recommendations too. Just because someone has a diagnosis does not mean that the ERPO should necessarily be granted. We want to make sure there's other factors in there that show that the risk is so severe and imminent. Again, court hearing wants to be quickly, 7 to 10 days. Burden of proof, we want that always to be on the petitioner, and we really do push too for the education. That's the pieces we see missing a lot, the education part and the data collection. We need to make sure people know how to go about this. So this is more for your use, where, like I said, we're seeing these come up in a lot of states, and I'm sure some of you in the room have already spoken with me about how you can work with legislators or other groups, and we've been getting approached about these bills a lot, which is another reason we ended up being involved, is a lot of groups are turning to us and for our expertise. So if you're approached either by a legislator or another organization, ask for a copy of the draft bill and in what capacity the legislator and or organization would like to work with AFSP. So are they looking for us to participate in an advocacy day or a rally, or are they just looking for kind of more behind the scenes, they want to know what language should be included? Tell them you'll follow up with after consulting with the AFSP Public Policy Office. Email our office and your field staff with a copy of the bill, a brief description of what the legislator or organization is looking for from AFSP. Simple enough. We then have a kind of rubric or model that we follow to analyze the bills. So I will analyze the bill from a suicide prevention perspective. We don't go beyond our scope of expertise. That's the way we're looking at it, based on a list of questions and considerations that's been approved by our national board. And then we will follow up with you within 48 to 72 hours with a decision on if or how we can support the bill in its current form. And whether or not we do, we will always provide input. So even if the bill comes to us and there's some, language that we can't support for any reason, we still want to make sure we provide recommendations so that that bill ends up stronger than it came to us. And this is on a case-by-case basis. Unlike some of our other priorities where the K through 12 training, and we typically tend to support most of them, this really is, we have to look at each bill very closely because of the type of issue it is. And just a reminder, make sure we're always included in any communication surrounding ERPOs and other firearm legislation. It's very important to keep us on the loop on this one, and your field staff. Okay, and now I'm going to turn it over to Tyler. So he actually worked on an ERPO bill in Arkansas very closely, and so he's going to talk about that experience.
All right, before I do that, I do want to remind you guys, you have some cards in your chairs. Take some notes, ask some questions. As we're going through this, I'm sure you're having your own individual experiences that you're thinking about or challenges that you're thinking about. Write those down so that we can address those whenever we close out the session. Okay, so how many of you have worked on extreme risk protection order legislation to date? Okay, so we've got 5 in the room. How many of you think that this should be a priority in your chapter? Everybody. That's why you're here, right? All right. So I'll tell you a little bit about my experience in Arkansas. The governor appointed me to the Arkansas Suicide Prevention Council a couple of years ago. We identified, obviously, that more than 63% of suicides in Arkansas are by firearm. So the council obviously had to come back to the governor and say, we have to talk about this. Obviously, being in a southern state, that we knew that we were going to have challenges. So the governor agreed with us. We needed to address this. So we built a coalition. And I think that's so important. And working with the National Shooting Sports Foundation and other like organizations, local organizations even, we built this coalition of people that understand that gun safety is different from restriction, right? What are the 2 reasons why people buy firearms? Safety, protection, and hunting. Yes. Those are the 2 reasons why most people buy firearms. Certainly in Arkansas, it's to protect my family, and it's and to hunt. So let's start this conversation with that perspective. Let's start this conversation with, okay, if you're purchasing this firearm to keep your family safe, let's make sure your family stays safe, right? If we start the conversation that way, then it's a completely different conversation, right? So let's focus on family safety. And sometimes that firearm in the home can help keep your family safer. Sometimes it can be a risk factor. So creating the conversation and front-loading the conversation that way is really, really important, especially whenever you're talking to not just your field advocates and members of your chapter, but especially when you're talking to your legislators. So I'll tell you a little bit about my experience. Elbow me whenever I'm running out of time. So I'll tell you about my experience in Arkansas. So a state senator reached out to me about, we need a red flag law in Arkansas. I said, okay, let's talk about this. So we talked for about 11 months. And we talked very specifically about what that legislation should look like and how it would be most effective. And he was very appreciative of our expertise. So I want you guys to recognize that you are the experts, right? Don't shy away from that. Whenever you're talking to your legislators, say, I can be the expert. Trust me. You've got a lot on your plate. Trust me to help you through this, and especially drafting language before it gets filed with BLR or with the on the floor. So so in Arkansas, we had one senator that had a very strong bill. We've been talking for 11 months. It was right with AFSP standards. It was had data collection in there. And then all of a sudden we had another state senator say, well, you know what, I'm going to file my own red flag law. And it didn't meet our standards. And so then we had two red flag laws, and I'm going to talk about our terminology a little about red flag in just a minute. But we had two competing bills that were about to be filed. They'd already gone to the Bureau of Legislative Research. So I got the two together. And I said, let's sit down. Let's talk about how we can compromise. Through that 2-hour meeting, we came together. There were a couple of things that we had to compromise on, but rather than having two competing bills, we had one bill that were supported by both. So having these conversations, and these are detailed, kind of wonky conversations sometimes, whenever you get down into the weeds of policy, it's important to have those specific conversations. Now I want to talk about the branding around legislation. We often don't think about how our vocabulary affects the perception of our legislation. We talk about branding with AFSP all the time, but let's talk about branding of legislation. So I was having a conversation with some of the leadership from AFSP yesterday about our terminology. We talk about red flag laws. Think about the context of red flag. So we've got a red alert. We've got red lights. It creates this sense of emergency, which there may be. And then we also have this sense of somebody's flagged, right? So going forward, I think it's really important whenever we're having these conversations with our media partners, with our legislative partners, with our volunteers, that we use the term extreme risk protection order. Because what are the connotations around protection? Like we talked about just a few minutes ago. Protection. We're talking about protecting our families, right? So as we go forward, and I would encourage you to not get stuck in the trap of saying ERPO. Use the term protection order, extreme risk protection order, especially when you're talking with your legislative partners, because that's a completely different connotation from a red flag law. All right, so the burden of proof, back to Taylor's point earlier, the burden of proof has been something that we've been challenged in Arkansas quite a bit about. The burden of proof should always be on the petitioner, and that should be part of your top line message, that no, we're not coming in to confiscate your weapons. We're creating a safe home environment. That's a completely different message, right? So that should be your top line message. I want to thank Doreen and her team for the education piece and our partnerships with the firearm safety community. I want to thank Taylor and our national office, our policy office, for their leadership. And also, I want to invite you guys, going forward, we understand that this is a complex issue, and each state is going to be individually, they're going to be unique challenges in each of your chapters. So reach out to the public policy office. Going through this, even though I've worked in public policy for quite some time, I bothered Taylor quite a bit. I called them almost on a daily basis, and whenever we were drafting the final legislation before it was filed, after it was filed, before we went into committee, I was talking with these guys, with the public policy team, all hours of the day. So lean on them, lean on your public policy council members, lean on us. Let us face these unique challenges that you're going to see. Also, work with your once you build your coalition, build a letter of support for this bill if the bill meets our standards, and that will be up to your public policy staff. Let them review the draft language before you decide if you're going to support it or not. Also, issue an action alert, because whenever this kind of legislation comes forward, in fact, what we did was we targeted the committee that was hearing, we targeted our field advocates that were constituents of the committee members. And then at the committee, show up. Show up. Now, I would suggest about half an hour before you go in, talk to them, look at the latest language, look at the agenda, and get our public policy team's advice on your talking points, and then sign up. Most committee meetings you can just walk into and sign up to speak on behalf, in favor or against a bill. Walk in and be that active constituent. Be bold. This is important. Your voice is important. And remember, what did I say? You are the experts. Don't ever forget that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so you should all have note cards, and Zoe's going to walk around for some questions. You might know this one, so I'm going to ask Dorian.
Hello?
Okay. So this is, did or does the NSSF share who their local members are with us as a database resource?
The answer to that is yes. So, can you all hear me? Okay. So there's two ways that you can find that information. On Chapterland, we do have a list. It's split into it's an Excel spreadsheet split into two Excel spreadsheets. I think one is like A through M, and the other is like, N through Z. So there is a listing. We got that list from NSSF probably about a year ago, and then because there are retailers with memberships, we probably need to just double check it. The other place is if you go to NSSF's website, there's a way to search their members. So I would just say either look on Chapterland or you can check their website. But if you have any questions about that or you can't find that, just email one of our team members. We're happy to make sure you get the list. Also, the area directors, the staff here have access to those lists, so you could also ask your area director.
All right, so this says, among certain politicians, there's a knee-jerk reaction to oppose any legislation that targets access to guns. Have you found any language that has potential to win some of these over? I'll turn to you in a minute. I do want to say, though, one of the big parts of that is the fact that we're framing this around suicide prevention. Some people who might be a little more deterred by framing it at risk to others, or thinking of, like the mass shooting aspect of it, which we stay away from. When we talk about suicide prevention and that your family might be at risk, most people know someone who's struggled, or they've had lost someone themselves. So I will say that that's why AFSP became involved with this, is because that is really helpful. And then I'll have you, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, Taylor, I think that's a great point. But yeah, it's kind of like what I talked about a few minutes ago. When we start this conversation around safety, because the purpose of purchasing a firearm quite often is about family safety and keeping your family protected. If we start the conversation that way and front load that conversation about safety, then yeah, that changes how the conversation is going to continue. So always start with, well, you know what? Firearms are a part of keeping your home safe. Sometimes firearms can make your home more dangerous. At those times, it's important that we recognize it and know what to do at those times. So yeah, always frame and front load the conversation about safety and about protecting your family, because like I said, most people buy firearms to protect their family or to hunt. So if you frame it, if you front load the conversation about protecting your family, then you're going to have a lot more success with that conversation.
Taylor, would you recommend putting safety into the title of legislation?
Yeah, that's certainly something that can be considered. Yeah, absolutely. And this actually, I just want to, also though it said, is it common for red flag bills to include language referring to mass shootings? No. Typically, it just says imminent risk of violence to self or others.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add, less specific to legislation, but more generally with this approach, some of the kind of key things I've brought up in these conversations is, our issue is suicide prevention. It's not ownership. It's suicide prevention, and reiterating that. I've also told them that, we are a volunteer organization with, thousands of volunteers across the country, both of who, some are firearm owners, some aren't. Like, that's not our issue at all. And I think just keeping it in your lane, but also realizing we represent communities at large, which are made up of firearm owners and non-firearm. The idea of ownership is not our issue at all. And I don't know if anybody in here is in Washington State, but the Safer Homes Coalition, they do a lot of work, firearms, they have NRA representation on that coalition. That's how they framed it in this context of safer homes.
Yeah, so yeah, and even in addition to safety, something we also always use as talking points is that we want it, and I said this earlier, we want it to be voluntary. We want there to be a mechanism for, if you are at risk, for someone to be able to give it to a family member or give it to a friend and remove it from the situation. This is just in cases where we know that's not possible and where we need to be able to help that person. So the next question, is there notice given to someone that a motion is being filed? And if so, does that cause them to act ahead of the hearing? It is not. That's why we want that ex parte. So ex parte means that it's going to be filed without a hearing. So that's why we will not support a bill that does not have that emergency mechanism in there. Okay. Who's responsible for removing the firearms? Once an order has been placed, it's always the local police officers. So in many cases, the petition has to be filed in the district where the subject of the petition resides, and then that police department is required to carry out the order. Tyler, this one's for you. What groups were involved in the task force and coalition and/or coalition?
We intentionally focused initially, whenever we were building the coalition or then the task force, on suicide prevention groups, other like-missioned groups. Then we worked with, there is a competitive shooting group in Arkansas. We reached out to their executive director, and they were right on board. We also partnered with the Department of Injury and Violence Prevention with the state to talk with them to get some data. Let's see, who else? We had a high school skeet shooting team that got on board. So we had some high school kids that were helping us frame this conversation. And you know what? In the hearing, that was a really powerful thing to have, a senior in high school to talk about how they want to make sure that their firearms are safe at home. So yeah, it was an interesting experience to see all of these different groups come together with the same mission. We didn't know that we had this common mission of firearm safety in the homes until we started talking about it. So really, it was we had somebody represented from the Attorney General's office. We had somebody from the Department of Behavioral Health. We had somebody from the Department of Health. So it was we worked with state agencies and then NGOs as well.
Okay. And Doreen, this is a question for you about military outreach in relation to all this.
So, and this is hot off the presses, which is why I always love this forum. It seems to occur at the right time. Very recently, the partnership that we have with NSSF, there was also a partnership signed, a kind of a three-way agreement in a way between the VA, us, and NSSF. And so what's happening at the local level right now with this is that they are piloting a toolkit that promotes safe, basically firearms safe storage coalitions at the local level. They're piloting it over the next year. If your state was one of the states, and I don't have the list off the top of my head, but your area director knows because they were invited to some calls about this. But the idea is this toolkit was developed, we reviewed it, and it's kind of getting disseminated to communities through the VA, but the idea is that it would be a community-led project. The challenge with this is you can give a toolkit to somebody, but if they're not going to take it and do something with it, right, then it's so groups at the local level, including veterans groups, are stepping up to be involved in this, and certainly the AFSP chapters have been part of those initial conversations. So my guess would be what you're going to see over the next year is kind of more work in that area. I would say at the local level, reach out to your VA suicide prevention coordinator. If you don't know who that person is, introduce yourself to them, because we have a national partnership with the VA, and lots of communication is getting trickled down through their leadership to their coordinators. But also, if you find your VA is not, they're kind of a late adopter of this because they have lots of other stuff going on, I would say also reach out to some of the veterans groups that meet in your community. Many of them host events and are happy to bring in a speaker to do Talk Saves Lives or something like that. So think about who those folks are naturally in your community. I don't know if that answers. I know it wasn't really a question. It was more like, are we reaching out to military? And the answer is to the veterans community specifically, because that's where, frankly, the risk is in the community. We're doing some work with DOD, but the risk is really in veterans groups versus active military. I mean, both groups are at risk, but in terms of where there's risk with firearms being in the home or unsafely stored, it really is more the veterans community.
So this one is, do you talk about red flag laws as an alternative to a 302 or an involuntary commitment? And what are the long-term consequences of being flagged? We don't talk about it, but it is an interesting idea, because like I know in Pennsylvania, if you are involuntarily committed, then for the rest of your life you can be denied firearm, and that's kind of permanent. That is not the case with these laws. It's after that year, that's it. Now the petitioner can certainly petition to renew the bill, to renew the order, but because they're often notified 3 months before it's up, do you think this person's still at risk? But if they don't, that's it. There's a background check to make sure nothing else happened that would restrict you, and then you're giving your firearms back. So that is an interesting concept to kind of talk about as an alternative, and just to be sure too, we wouldn't support a bill that wouldn't automatically give the person their rights back after a year. That would be one of our things. And that was another question: what are the most common reasons we don't support the bills that have been introduced? That's been one. Another one is, like I said, if it doesn't have the emergency piece of it. And it's often about like burden of proof reasons. So we really want to make sure there's protections in place for the respondent. And then do we have time?
Can I
Go
just
ahead,
say something
please.
really
Yeah.
quick? And one of the reasons that's so important has to do with what we know about suicide risk, in that it fluctuates. That a person could be at risk at some point in the past, and their risk may not be at the same elevated level 2 years later or 3 years later. And the burden of proof piece, or the due process piece, is important, because you can't just rely on mental health diagnosis to drive that. If you think of the millions of people who are diagnosed with depression annually and do not carry suicide risk, acute suicide risk as part of that, and some of them may not carry risk compared to others. Just the diagnosis puts them in a different category, but in terms of actual risk, so if you were to send someone like that to an emergency hospital room and they did an assessment for suicide, they may not be detected in short-term risk. So that's why, I hope I'm being clear about that, but that's why the burden of proof has to show risk, or has to show that access to a firearm is dangerous in this situation. Because I think what also happens is you have family members who aren't willing to enact these if there's not that in place, because there's this fear that, you know, if I put this person and they end up on a list or something like that, that's going to create long-term consequences for what really, in terms of suicide risk, is an intense acute situation. Does that make sense? I hope so.
Yes. So it's time to wrap up. There might have been one or two questions. Please feel free to reach out to our office, especially now that legislative sessions are about up. We can start getting ready for next year. So we're happy to work with all of you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.